When Isabella caught her sisters-in-law having intimate relations with knights, she resorted to an extremely gruesome punishment to ensure it wouldn't happen again. Isabella of France began her life as an innocent French maid, and ended it as one of the most ruthless monarchs England ever saw. 14th century France was a viper's nest of dangerous beauties, courtly intrigue, and all-out war. Somehow Isabella of France managed to master all three realms, from her beginnings as a naive bride to her jaw-dropping vengeance on her own kin. There's a reason she became known as the she-wolf of France. Isabella was born around 1295 to an extremely powerful and intensely cold family. Her father, King Philip IV of France, was known as the Fair for his good looks, but was also described as neither a man nor a beast, but a statue, for his chilly demeanour. Meanwhile, her mother Joan died when she was still young, amidst rumours that Isabella's father had killed her. As daughter of the King of France, and a calculating king at that, Isabella was always destined for a politically advantageous marriage. In her case, it happened very fast. When she was 12 years old, she was sent to England to marry King Edward II, a man around 10 years her senior. The royal union took place on January 25th, 1308. I know she doesn't look 12 here, Braveheart was not historically accurate, let's just go with it. It was already common knowledge in Europe that Isabella's father was good-looking, as well as her brothers. But one man described her around the time of her marriage as the beauty of beauties, in the kingdom, if not in all Europe. A short time before their marriage, Edward had fallen in with a favourite, the courtier Piers Gaveston. Debate has raged about the exact nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship, with some historians describing them as adoptive brothers, and others pointing to a more scandalous truth. At only 12 years old, Isabella could hardly have been much of an enticement for Edward on their wedding day, but his treatment of her shocked people. At the coronation feast on their return to England as a couple, her new husband reportedly spent most of his time with Gaveston and ignored his young bride. Before long, it was common knowledge that the new queen loathed the king's pet, and the royal household grew tense. The new queen was alone in a foreign court, but she wasn't alone in her opinions. Edward's courtiers, particularly a strong faction of barons, were incensed at the responsibilities he was giving Gaveston. More than that, she also had the might of her father back in France, so she did what any daughter would do. She complained to Daddy. Isabella's father was naturally furious when he heard about the way the King of England was treating his daughter, furious enough that the French royal family soon teamed up with Edward's disgruntled courtiers. After secretly funding Edward's barons and influencing matters in Parliament, Isabella and her allies had Gaveston exiled from court. In the end, nothing could keep Edward and Gaveston apart, and he lived in exile for only about a year. When he returned, Isabella changed tactics. She decided it was better to join Gaveston than try to beat him. Where before she pitted herself against him, she now became his ally. It was a smart move, and it worked to unite the royal household, but only for a time. In 1311, the barons rose up again, this time not just against Gaveston, but against his new ally, Isabella, briefly expelling her from her own court. With all this going on, Isabella's realm was in a full-blown civil war by 1312. She stuck to her husband's side as he fought the barons, as did Piers Gaveston. But that summer, the king's favourite met a brutal end. The barons surrounded his castle, captured him, and quickly executed him. On the day Piers Gaveston was executed, Isabella was some months pregnant, and that November she gave birth to a son, the future Edward III. The healthy baby boy helped cement her place as queen, but it didn't calm the tensions in her court. Over the next few years, England was falling apart. Not only did Edward suffer humiliation and a series of defeats by the Scottish, but the Great Famine also descended on the country. Edward's feisty barons were quick to blame him, and they didn't spare Isabella either, taking away many of her funds and trying to control her household to gain greater power over the kingdom. Although she had always been involved in court politics, Isabella now started to believe that if her husband couldn't rule properly, maybe she could, and began attending council meetings and acquiring more land for herself. Around this time, Isabella's husband found himself a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man near his own age who came from a family who had long supported Edward, particularly the patriarch, Hugh the Elder. This may have looked like a good thing on the surface, at least for Edward's personal life, but it was one of the most dangerous things he could have done. Thanks, in fact, to their very loyalty to Edward, the Despensers had many enemies at court, and the barons were immediately in an uproar when Edward began, as he had with the late Piers Gaveston, lavishing Hugh with gifts. Perhaps most crucially, Isabella was unable to develop the same kind of alliance with Hugh as she had eventually fostered with Piers. In 1322, Edward and Isabella were camped out and in the thick of fighting once more against Scotland, when, in Isabella's view, Despenser's negligence or even outright antagonism resulted in her getting cut off from her husband and his men. Even worse, Scottish troops began pursuing her now vulnerable household, eventually killing 2 of her ladies-in-waiting. When Isabella finally made it to safety, she was furious at Edward and his pet, and she let him know. Probably sick of the sight of her husband, she left on a nearly year-long trip around England. To make matters worse, tensions with Isabella's native France were growing. Fearful of her connections in France in the midst of the tense political landscape, the king and the Despensers snatched Isabella's lands, overtook her household, put her French staff behind bars, and took her youngest children from her and put them in the Despensers' care. After more French-English bickering, Isabella's brother, now King Charles IV of France, seized all of King Edward's French possessions in 1325. In response, Edward sent Isabella to her home country to broker some kind of peace. Many nobles who opposed Edward took this as a sign that the King of England's power was fracturing. They didn't know the half of it. Because while Isabella was ostensibly trying to smooth over French and English egos, she was doing something else entirely. While in the French court, there's convincing evidence that Isabella began an affair with Englishman Roger Mortimer, a noble who, like Isabella herself, loved fine art, enjoyed spending money, and had long despised the Despensers. In fact, when it came to rebelling, Mortimer had history. Back in 1321, Mortimer was with a group of other opposing lords in leading the Despenser War against Edward's favourite Hugh and his powerful family. Mortimer got thrown in the Tower of London for his troubles and made a spectacular escape after some friends in high places drugged his warders at a feast. When word of Isabella's behaviour reached King Edward in England, he began trying to get her home and within his own power. In the middle of 1326, Isabella put a plan into action. After months of unrest, gathering allies and stewing in her resentment for her husband, she and her reported lover Roger Mortimer gathered an army, complete with warships, and set sail to invade England. Isabella and Mortimer landed in Orwell on the east coast of England and led their troops inland, gathering supporters as they went. This was actually incredibly easy. Most everyone was tired of the Despensers and many greeted her as a saviour. When he heard the news of the invasion, King Edward, not ignorant of his unpopularity, fled to Wales. Within months, Isabella's men had not only rounded up Hugh Despenser the Elder, but had also nabbed King Edward II and his favourite, Hugh the Younger, in their hiding place in Wales. Isabella had acquired her targets, and all that was left to do was punish them. There was no mercy for Isabella's enemies. Even if she wanted to give it, her supporters were bloodthirsty. Hugh Despenser the Elder's remains were quite literally fed to dogs, while Edward's favourite, Hugh the Younger, endured men scrawling biblical verses on his skin before being hanged as a thief, a low insult for a noble-born man. Then he was drawn and quartered. In Edward, Isabella had a real problem. Not only was he still her lawful husband, but he was also still the lawful king. Although Parliament decided to depose him and place him under a life sentence of house arrest, she worried they wouldn't follow through, or that even if they did, it wouldn't be enough. By the following September, Edward was a captive in Berkeley Castle by the Welsh borders. On the 23rd of that month, Isabella got word that Edward had died from a frustratingly vague, fatal accident. Given the convenience of Edward's death for Isabella, historians have argued for centuries about whether Isabella and Mortimer had him killed. We'll likely never know the truth. Isabella certainly had the motive, but it's possible she simply got lucky and Edward died of ill health in captivity. Although there is one even stranger interpretation of events. After the news of Edward's death, there were persistent rumours that he didn't actually die, but had escaped and was now living somewhere in Europe. While Edward wouldn't be the first ruler to be subject to rumours like this, he's one of the few with historians who support the theory. Historians examined contemporary evidence, including the famous Fieschi letter from the 1340s that claims he was alive, and argue that Edward did in fact live, going under a different name for the rest of his life. Isabella had now got everything she'd wanted when she first set sail from France, and ruled as regent for her young son. But it all unravelled alarmingly quickly. She and Mortimer had always loved expensive things, including flashy shows of power. This didn't sit well with the court, and soon tensions were flaring up all over again and nearly leading to civil war. Until Isabella's son took matters into his own hands. The new Edward III had no love lost for the way his mother and her lover spent the kingdom's money, and even less for his mother's lover himself. It all came to a dramatic climax. Just days before Edward III turned 18 and officially came into his own, he had Mortimer and Isabella seized inside Nottingham Castle. Isabella understood immediately what was happening. Even as they were dragged away, Isabella begged her son to spare Mortimer's life. It was no use. Edward had Mortimer hanged in November 1330, with his body displayed on the gallows for the public to witness for 2 days after. Isabella managed to save her own skin in this debacle, thanks quite likely to being the mother of the king, and only received a spell of house arrest at Windsor Castle. But the true punishment was invisible. There's some evidence she suffered a nervous breakdown after Mortimer's death, and it took some time for her to regain her health. Isabella remained a fixture at court, and was, to nobody's surprise, something of a social butterfly. She retained her interest in jewels and amassing wealth, and soon doted on her grandchildren.
How to add sweetness to your life? When you want a snack or prepare for the holiday parties, don't forget this cookie for you and your family. They are so delicious. Also, these cookies are keto-friendly and vegan. Each cookie only has a few grams of sugar. Perfect for adding a little bit of sweetness to your life.